We are aware of something being there, yet we do not really know where or what it is. This remains a mystery. Are ghosts just figments of our imagination? Or do they reveal hidden truths about a reality beyond our senses? Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher who tried to look beyond the physical world, had a surprising answer. Ghosts aren't simply illusions, but they're glimpses of a dimension beyond the material, flickers of another world breaking through to our world, beings beyond space and time, the afterglow of a consciousness that recently left existence. Well, maybe. The fact remains, however, that Schopenhauer took ghosts, or spirit apparitions, very seriously, along with a host of other paranormal phenomena like dreams of prophecy, clairvoyance, and magic. He had over 100 books on the paranormal in his personal library, and he had some personal experiences that convinced him it wasn't just all made up nonsense. In fact, a dream once convinced him to move out of Berlin, just 1 year before an epidemic would ravage that city. And in what he himself calls a perfectly clear apparition while being wide awake, he saw the ghost of his dead father. If there is to be an explanation for ghosts and the paranormal in general, then I believe Schopenhauer came closer than anyone in trying to explain these strange experiences, because he appeals to nothing except what is already there in his philosophical system, without having to resort to the supernatural. There is, in fact, room in his philosophy for the paranormal. So, how does he try to explain the existence of ghosts and prophetic dreams? Where do they fit into his philosophical system? That will be the subject of today's video. This is a controversial topic, so we're really going to take our time to build up the argument exactly how Schopenhauer does it. First, I'll give you some general context on the paranormal in the 19th century and why this period seemed uniquely ready to accept the paranormal, and then we'll get into Schopenhauer's essay on the subject of ghosts. I'll warn you in advance that Schopenhauer uses the subject of dreams to build his argument about ghosts. Schopenhauer knew he couldn't just start talking about ghosts right off the bat, and he knew that his readers needed to be warmed up, so to speak. So he starts out his argument by talking about dreams, because people can dismiss the existence of ghosts right away, but no one doubts the existence of dreams. Yet somehow, Schopenhauer argues, dreams and ghosts are connected. So a large part of this video will deal with the subject of dreaming, lucid dreaming, sleepwalking, and other related phenomena. But I promise you, it will all lead up to a grand finale about ghosts. It really is fascinating how Schopenhauer starts off talking about something private and subjective like a dream, and somehow ends up talking about ghosts that seem to exist in the objective world some way, as if the dream world is intruding on our own world. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, get some coffee, black of course, and join us into this strange world of ghosts, sleepwalking, and magic, and the surprising way that Schopenhauer fits all of these things into a philosophy without having to appeal to a supernatural explanation. This video is made possible by our patrons. Thank you. If you want to access the exclusive material we make while supporting the channel, join us on Patreon. There is a link in the description. So, as we said, Schopenhauer explains spirit apparitions without having to add anything else to his main philosophy. But why would he bother to explain ghosts in the first place? Perhaps that is the first question we should answer. Schopenhauer lived in the 19th century, a period of time infamous for its fascination with the paranormal and its superstition in religion. The reasons for this could fill its own video, but here's an incomplete and preliminary sketch to set the stage. First of all, we are exiting the age of enlightenment and entering the age of romanticism. Romanticism, broadly speaking, put more stock in emotion and feeling than in rationality and reason, and it gave more weight to subjective experience as a potential source of truth. Passion and intuition became more important. All of this is fertile breeding ground for a broader fascination with the supernatural. Romanticism bleeds through in every aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy, most specifically when he talks about the nature of the beautiful and the sublime, as well as the endpoint of his philosophy, which is mysticism. But we'll get to Schopenhauer's philosophy in more detail later. Something that surprises a lot of people is that the witch burnings didn't happen in the Middle Ages. Their peak, in America as well as in Europe, was in the 1600s, while most historians put the end of the Middle Ages at around 1453 with the fall of Constantinople. In the popular imagination, we associate witch burnings with the Middle Ages, but the chronology simply doesn't fit. It's actually in the early modern period, the era of Francis Bacon, Newton, Kepler, Descartes, Spinoza, that we see the most fanatical witch hunts. The 1600s, this is the Renaissance, the age of the scientific revolution, the age of reason. But it was also the age of superstition. We see evidence of this not just in the prevalence of witch trials, but in every layer of society. This paradox, the widespread belief in superstition during the so-called Age of Reason, was not lost on people. Nietzsche offers a psychological explanation. Europe was freeing itself from the shackles of religious dogmatism. Reason was allowed to be autonomous, and like a great dam that finally bursts, it went everywhere and in all directions in a violent explosion. The great leaps in science were accompanied by a proliferation of superstitious beliefs as a side effect of the newfound freedom of thought, like Shakespeare's metaphor of greyhounds in the slips straining upon the start, finally let loose. Whether or not this psychological explanation of Nietzsche's holds water, it's true that with the Age of Enlightenment, there is this strange openness to the paranormal. Immanuel Kant, in his younger years, even wrote an essay where he satirized and mocked claims by Emanuel Swedenborg, an extremely popular and influential Swedish scientist and mystic who claimed to have had prophetic dreams and visions concerning the second coming of Christ and other such theological matters. It's important to note that this essay of Kant's was written before his so-called transcendental turn, that is to say, before the publication of his famous 3 critiques where he expounds on his philosophy of transcendental idealism. This is important for when we finally get to Schopenhauer. The fascination for the supernatural had other explanations, however. Another interesting one is found in the political situation of 19th century Germany. In the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, which put an end to the political entity known as the Holy Roman Empire, combined with the resulting rise in nationalism all over Europe, the new nation of Germany was in its infancy. The fledgling nation was looking to write its own story and decide its own future. But in order to do so, it had to first write the story of its past. The Romantic era in Germany is marked by a noted increase in interest in German folk customs and legends. This is the era of the brothers Grimm, who compiled myths, legends, and fairy tales collected all over the German territory. This was not purely an academic exercise. There was also the belief that in studying these folk tales, we could come to an understanding of the essential character of the German people. But political and nation-building elements aside, this renewed interest in folk tales and fairy tales, filled as they are with supernatural elements, is another ingredient that made this time period such a welcoming fertile ground for fascination with the supernatural. All these things taken together, the large, overarching movement of Romanticism, the susceptibility to superstition, and the interest in folk tales and fairy tales brought forth by the search for a new German identity, all these things point towards a general openness to the supernatural. But we need to mention one more thing, and in my opinion, it's perhaps the most important, yet somehow the most overlooked ingredient. It is the gradual discovery of electricity. In the 1800s, people were doing experiments with this strange, invisible, newly discovered force, and the possibilities seemed nearly endless. Obviously, electricity is a natural, not a supernatural phenomenon. But try to get into the mindset of a curious person who lives during this period of time. Scientists discovered this invisible, mysterious force that seems to have the power to bring about real changes in nature. This is the age of Alessandro Volta, Luigi Galvani, Michael Faraday, André-Marie Ampère, and James Clerk Maxwell somehow figured out that electricity and magnetism are linked. Two strange, unseen forces that seem to be all around us in nature, which are totally beyond our perception, yet seem to be able to bring about the most spectacular changes in physical objects. It's not hard to see how alluring the thought must be to just imagine how many other forces like this existed in the world just waiting to be discovered. Science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke has a famous quote that says that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. Imagine showing the wonders of electricity and magnetism to someone living in the 1400s. Wouldn't it appear just like magic to them? The minds of Europe were already hospitable to thoughts of magic and superstition for the reasons that we just outlined. But I believe this recent discovery of electricity, and more precisely, the fact that electricity was still not even fully understood, that really put people's heads in overdrive and made them ready to accept ideas that we would today find eccentric at best and insane at worst. Still, it's important to remember all this context going forward, because we might get into strange territory here. And of course, it has puzzled people for decades that ostensibly smart men like Schopenhauer, or Isaac Newton for that matter, could believe in such silly things as they did. Well, maybe it's all not so strange and silly after all, but we'll get to it. First, a short note on Schopenhauer in particular. We've talked about the general context in which these ideas grew and found their germination. But Schopenhauer had personal reasons as well to believe in the supernatural. He had first-hand experience with them. Schopenhauer had more than a few brushes with the paranormal. One curious anecdote relates how he correctly guessed 2 of the 3 lottery numbers that his landlady played the day before. The only reason he didn't get the 3rd one right is because, according to himself, the astonishment on his landlady's face awakened him from his brief clairvoyant trance and activated the rational part of his brain, and so the clairvoyant part of it lost energy. It literally lost brain power, and therefore his final guess was a wrong one. This might sound strange, but I promise we'll explore into more detail how Schopenhauer thought about the paranormal and how it relates to our brains. His experience with the supernatural isn't merely confined to curiosity either. He also allowed it to inform major life decisions. On New Year's Eve 1830, when Schopenhauer was living in Berlin, he had a dream about a childhood friend of his who had passed away a long time ago, when Schopenhauer was only 10 years old. He never really thought about him anymore, so the appearance in his dream was interpreted by Schopenhauer as an omen. The dream somehow convinced him that if he didn't leave Berlin, he would die the following year. Now, as it turns out, in the following year, a cholera outbreak reached Germany. It reached Berlin, and famously, Schopenhauer's arch-nemesis, the philosopher Hegel, succumbed to the disease. Schopenhauer himself, however, by this time had moved to the cholera-free city of Frankfurt, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Coincidence or not, it's not difficult to see how a brush with death like this, predicted 1 year prior in a prophetic dream, could influence Schopenhauer's openness to the paranormal. But it doesn't stop there. Soon after arriving in Frankfurt, he writes that he saw a perfectly clear apparition of his parents, with his father, who had died many years ago, carrying a torchlight. From this supernatural scene, which was not a dream but an apparition he had while awake, Schopenhauer concluded that he would outlive his mother. At least that's the meaning he ascribed to this particular vision. As it turns out, this also came to pass, and Schopenhauer did indeed outlive his mother. To be sure though, that would have been the statistically most likely outcome anyway, and of course, with such a vague vision, he might as well have come to a completely opposite interpretation. But in any case, this spirit or ghost encounter was another personal experience of Schopenhauer with the paranormal. Were these dreams, his interpretations, and the strange coincidences of his life all one big misunderstanding, or did Schopenhauer unwittingly stumble upon the actual supernatural? In any case, Schopenhauer was very interested in the supernatural, as were his contemporaries for reasons we just outlined, and combined with the fact that he himself, from first-hand experience, seemed to come into contact with all these strange phenomena, it's not hard to see how Schopenhauer, who always viewed himself as a philosopher who tried to explain the entire riddle of existence, could try and find a philosophical explanation for what exactly happened to him. And that is what he did. Schopenhauer saw the ghost of his dead father. Just how does he explain this? If you're only familiar with Schopenhauer through his main work, The World as Will and Representation, you might be surprised to learn about this fascination Schopenhauer had with the paranormal. Volume 1, which was released in 1818, is completely and totally silent on the matter. We can assume this was a deliberate choice on Schopenhauer's part. In his mind, he was creating a completely new philosophical system. Writing in the decades after Kant, he saw himself as Kant's only true and real successor. Moreover, he had to compete with many post-Kantian philosophers like Fichte and Hegel, whom he regarded as charlatans abusing Kant's name. It was his responsibility to introduce this new philosophical system to the world and convince everyone that only he was carrying Kant's true legacy. He was very well aware that too much talk about ghosts would not only distract from his philosophical message, it would also arouse the skepticism of his readers. A luxury he couldn't afford as a philosopher startup. Volume 2 was written a few decades later, but consists entirely of elucidations of Volume 1. So here too, Schopenhauer doesn't mention the paranormal. In fact, he even repeats the stance of both Kant and Spinoza against spiritualism, against the idea that there is a spiritual world out there which has some kind of objective existence. There are three big ways of looking at the world, according to Schopenhauer, and only his is right. There is, on the one hand, crude realist materialism, which regards the material world as the only real world, and on the other hand, there is dualist spiritualism, which holds that there are two spheres of existence. There is both the material and the spiritual, and then finally, the third way of looking at the world is idealism, the school to which Kant and Schopenhauer himself belonged. So, ostensibly, in denying the existence of an objective spiritual world, it seems like Schopenhauer is closing the door to the possible existence of ghosts. But things are not so simple. Schopenhauer didn't just write his main philosophical work, but he also wrote a collection of essays. These essays are not strictly philosophical in nature. They also deal out life advice, engage with Schopenhauer's personal opinions, and they dive into historical, archaeological, mythological, and linguistic speculations. Ironically, it's these essays, and not his big philosophical work, that initially brought him fame and recognition. The interest in his philosophy was a byproduct of the big interest in his personal essays. And it's in these essays that Schopenhauer felt more at ease to talk about his personal convictions instead of sticking to the strictly philosophical. One of the essays is entitled Essay on Spirit Seeing and Related Issues. This essay provides the bulk of Schopenhauer's speculations on the paranormal. So let's get into it. If you've read some Schopenhauer in the past, and you get a feel for his authorial voice, then this essay might come as a surprise to you. Schopenhauer is uncharacteristically very modest in his approach to the paranormal, whereas in his normal philosophical writings, his confidence radiates through every page. In this essay, nearly every statement is qualified in some way. This is the man, after all, who claimed to have solved the riddle of existence, who said that he created an entirely new philosophical system built on Kantian foundations, the only philosopher, in fact, who could be rightly called Kant's successor, and certainly not talentless hacks like Fichte and Hegel. The man who boasted that posterity would build statues of him, who claimed that his book, The World as Will and Representation, would be the basis of 100 other books. He spares no one, as he's quick to point out flaws in every philosopher before him, from Aristotle to Descartes. Yet, in this essay, we find qualifying statements throughout. Schopenhauer admits to participating in speculation. He says the true nature of the paranormal is still mysterious. And although he tries his best to explain these phenomena without appealing to anything outside of his main philosophy, he nevertheless holds out the hope that someone after him will finish the work he started with what he calls a preliminary sketch. In short, you get the feeling he isn't quite sure of himself, and in the writings of other philosophers, this would be a commendable and noble show of humility, but we know Schopenhauer simply wasn't a humble person. It seems to me he had a strong personal conviction on the paranormal, but struggled to really put it into rational, philosophical language, and so he tried to preemptively shield himself from criticism by taking recourse to protective, conditional language. Whatever his motivations may be, and whatever your personal ideas on the paranormal might be, dear viewer, even if you think Schopenhauer is completely in the wrong here, Schopenhauer's essay is an invaluable document in the history of ideas for the simple fact that Schopenhauer goes to great lengths to quote at length from the existing literature on the paranormal. As a document of compilation and scholarship, it's a real masterpiece. We can imagine another ulterior motive at work here. Schopenhauer really feels the need to show to the reader that the paranormal is not this marginal phenomenon. He really wants to hammer home the message that peoples of all times and places have experienced spirit apparitions, prophetic dreams, magic, communications with the dead. He quotes examples from Greek and Latin literature, as well as contemporary reports of doctors and psychiatrists from all over the world, padded with choice quotations from other compilations like Sir Walter Scott's letters on demonology and witchcraft. It's almost like he's trying to convince you of the existence of ghosts by pointing out just how many other people believe in them as well, and therefore that it's not so strange after all to take the phenomenon seriously. We almost drown in the manifold examples that Schopenhauer provides and categorizes according to their most essential quality. As such, this work, even if you don't buy into the philosophical explanation he provides, is invaluable as a work of idea history. To be completely honest, Schopenhauer's philosophy in this essay has the habit of simply drowning in all the examples that Schopenhauer continuously provides. Whereas Schopenhauer is usually very clear and distinct in his language, here it seems like he tried to almost hide his philosophy and tries to trick the reader into thinking there is more here than there actually is, by bringing up example after example of this or that woman who saw this or that ghost one time. That's because Schopenhauer here is not quite as self-assured as he normally is. His explanation is actually really fascinating, and he goes to careful lengths to build his case step by step. I've done the hard work of distilling Schopenhauer's philosophy from the endless twists and turns and distracting examples Schopenhauer provides in his essay. So, let's get into the meat of the matter. The question we're here to solve is, how is it possible for people to see ghosts and communicate with them? As Schopenhauer's many examples try to show, this is an almost natural human experience. Schopenhauer calls the belief in ghosts even innate in human beings, the default setting, and only modern European man, Schopenhauer implies, with the scientific revolution right behind him, grew up out of his civilizational childhood and recognized the truth that ghosts are not real. Or are they? Did the scientific revolution maybe go too far? In one important aspect, Schopenhauer did seem to think so, in its promotion of materialism. The idea that the material world is the only world of importance, that the senses alone can penetrate into the deepest depths of existence. This, Schopenhauer thought, was a huge mistake. Materialism was one of the fruits of the scientific revolution, but it was a rotten fruit, a huge mistake, an error thankfully rectified by Kant and himself. We mentioned earlier Kant's scathing essay against Emanuel Swedenborg. We noted how Kant wrote his essay before his transcendental turn. That was important because whether Kant realized it or not, in championing transcendental idealism a few years later, he opened the door towards the paranormal. Kant posited that the noumenal world, the Ding an sich, the totally objective world of real metaphysical importance, was this forever unknown entity. The world as it appears to us is already the world with a measure of subjectivity injected into it, a world qualified by human intuition and cognition. The world as it really is, however, the metaphysical instead of the physical world, this world is forever mysterious to us. The so-called post-Kantians took up this idea and, contrary to Kant's explicit warnings, started to speculate on the nature of this metaphysical noumenal world. All of these post-Kantians, particularly Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel, got it all completely wrong. According to Schopenhauer, only one post-Kantian got everything right: Schopenhauer himself. Kant said we cannot say anything about the noumenal world with any degree of certainty except that it does exist. That is all we can say. Schopenhauer disagreed, and by building upon Kant's own words, he was able to deduce that the noumenal world must have some characteristics that we can define. For example, Kant said space and time are a priori categories of human intuition. As such, they only exist in the phenomenal world, the physical world. As for the metaphysical world, it is this thing that is without space and time. Schopenhauer's great achievement, then, at least where Kant's philosophy is concerned, is that he realized that this means that we can say something about the noumenal world after all, namely that it's timeless and spaceless. That might sound like it doesn't really say anything, but it's important. It's in fact the foundation stone for Schopenhauer's entire philosophy of the will. The will is simply Schopenhauer's term for Kant's noumenal or metaphysical world. He gave it the name of will because we humans become acquainted with this other world through what philosophers in the 18th century called will, as opposed to our intellect. It's a long story, but in short, our hunger pangs, our emotions of sadness, the pain and pleasure that we feel, these are all functions of the will, not of the intellect. It's through these emotions that we gain highly subjective knowledge of the will, of this metaphysical undercurrent of reality, and it exists not simply in our bodies, but it permeates reality everywhere. It's just that we can only know it intimately through our own bodily experience. Compare it to the fable of the blind men who have to describe an elephant. One of them feels its trunk, and he thinks an elephant is defined by his trunk. Another feels its legs, and he defines an elephant by its legs. Another feels its tusks, and so on and so on. The moral of the story is that they all have a limited experience of the elephant, and then they make the mistake of extrapolating their narrow experience of the elephant to their definition of an elephant at large. Schopenhauer does a similar thing when he calls the will the will. It's named after our own intimate experience of the broader metaphysical undercurrent. To use a Latin phrase, it's a pars pro toto term, using the part of something to refer to the whole, like when we say boots on the ground when referring to soldiers. In any case, the will is Schopenhauer's chosen term for the metaphysical underpinning of the world, the real world of actual importance. The material world of the here and now, the physical world which Schopenhauer calls representation, is only a mirror image of this primordial world of will. So the world appears to us in two aspects, as will and as representation. Hence, of course, the title of Schopenhauer's main work, The World as Will and Representation. Everything that happens in the material world of representation has its counterpart in the world as will. It's just that this world of will, aside from our brief subjective experience of our own emotions, is a completely foreign and unknowable thing to us. But you can see how we are gradually collecting the building blocks for Schopenhauer's theory of the paranormal. Apparently, there is this entire other world out there. Well, to be exact, a more precise way to put it is to say that this world that we inhabit, as knowing, experiencing, thinking creatures, is the mirror image of the world as will, like two sides of the same coin. Aside from the brief glimpse we get into this other world through our own mood and emotions, this other world is entirely foreign to us. But is the separation between world as will and world as representation really all that strict? After all, through our own state of mind, our own feelings of pain, happiness, hunger, lust, boredom, we seem to be able to access this other side of the world. It's in fact in Schopenhauer's championing of idealism and in positing that the material physical world is the mirror image of an immaterial metaphysical world that he leaves open at least the possibility of the paranormal. Schopenhauer says that when we accept idealism, we at least cannot simply deny the possibility of the paranormal outright. We must either accept it somehow, or come up with good reasons to deny it. But we cannot dismiss it out of hand anymore, as a naive materialist is able to do. So let's investigate. Schopenhauer begins his investigation into spirit apparitions in perhaps an unlikely, but in hindsight totally obvious place. However, we must make an important distinction first. There is a difference between the existence of ghosts and the experience of seeing a ghost. The former can possibly be denied. The latter, however, is a completely established fact. Let's say you don't believe in ghosts at all. Fine. But in this case, you still have to account for the experience of ghosts that many people have. In fact, that's why Schopenhauer is so diligent in bringing up example after example and sourcing compilation book after compilation book. This is the route Schopenhauer will take to speculate on spirit apparitions. He takes a kind of middle position between two possible extremes. On the one hand, there is crude materialism. For Schopenhauer, these materialists are enemies. Their philosophy was popular in his day, and it still is to this day, and he had a bit of a vendetta against them, trying to prove them wrong with his own philosophy. According to materialism, the material world is all there is, and ghosts, by definition immaterial beings, simply cannot exist. So if you do see a ghost, it must either be a hallucination, or you must be lying. If it's a hallucination, then it's a completely subjective experience. The other extreme is what Schopenhauer calls spiritualism. This is the idea that there is not only the material world, but that there is also a spirit world. Every now and then, these worlds overlap, and when that happens, that's when people see a ghost. According to this theory, ghosts have a real, objective existence. They are actual entities that exist in the universe. They just exist somewhere else, beyond the material. Their existence, however, is an objective fact. To be clear, Schopenhauer is against this too. He doesn't spend too much time on repudiating it. He basically implies that this is a childish way of looking at the world, even though most of early civilizations seem to share a similar belief in a beyond world like this. Think of shamanism in the Americas, or the animism in pre-Christian Europe. These folk beliefs are helpful in doing anthropological research and in trying to determine the so-called innate beliefs of humans. But Schopenhauer is a child of the Enlightenment as much as of Romanticism, and in his scientific worldview, we simply can't accept the truth of an idea like this. Schopenhauer's own position is a third position somewhere in the middle. In Schopenhauer's worldview, ghosts, if they exist, have no objective existence in the material world, like how a tree or a glass of water has an existence, but they might have some kind of subjective existence that is less than an objective existence, yet more than a completely subjective existence. Again, something in the middle. You could say they have an ideal existence, after his philosophy of idealism. The best way to make this more clear, and this is also where Schopenhauer starts his investigation, is to talk about dreams. What is a dream? I don't need to explain it to you, but when you think about it more deeply, dreams are actually quite interesting phenomena. They go to the root of the problem presented before us here. Are dreams real? Well, obviously dreams are real. But do dreams exist in the real world? Not really. They're basically hallucinations. They're subjective visions, accessible only to the individual who is having the dream. Obviously, when we ask ourselves the question, are ghosts real? What we mean by that question is, do ghosts have an objective existence in material reality? But when we ask, are dreams real? We don't really refer to the content of the dream itself. We just refer to the act of dreaming. So if you dream about flunking an exam in high school, that dream is real. You actually do have that dream. But does your dream exist in objective reality? That's a tricky question. It's obvious that the content of your dream doesn't exist in material reality. You're laying in bed. You're not in high school failing a test. But the fact is that you are dreaming. The thing itself, that is very much real. If someone would be taking a brain scan while you're asleep, your brain would show, this person is dreaming. If I then ask you, after you wake up, were you in high school a few minutes ago? You will answer, no, I wasn't. I was laying in bed, but in my dream I was in high school. Did you realize during your dream that you were dreaming? Often, most of the time actually, people don't realize it until they wake up or right before they wake up. The notable exception here is the so-called lucid dream, but these are not of our concern yet. The fact is that for all intents and purposes, you did experience something that is as close to real as it gets while it was happening. You really believed you were in high school flunking a test. It's only upon waking up that you realize the truth. But, of course, dreams are not real. They are hallucinations, completely self-contained subjective experiences, and they seem to take place in another world, in the dream world, and not in this, our own world. The entire world of the dream is completely invented by your brain. Ghost stories are different. Spirit apparitions take place in our own physical reality, and if ghosts are merely hallucinations, then they are a kind of mixed hallucination. There is a subjective element, the ghost, that appears in the objective world. So dreams are not spirit apparitions. So why does Schopenhauer bother to even talk about them? For two reasons. First, they provide an intuitive example to show how the line between what is real and what is not can be blurry. The question, are ghosts real, is different from the question, are dreams real? The analogy is, ghosts might not be real, but the experience of seeing the ghosts, that is definitely real. In the same way, dreams are not real. You're not actually in high school, but the experience of thinking you're in high school is real. It's this open-mindedness we need to have to really understand Schopenhauer's points going forward. Second, and this is the really important part, for Schopenhauer, dreams prove that the brain can generate images and experiences without any external stimuli. This is really, really important. Schopenhauer takes a moment to really consider what a dream is exactly. He distinguishes dreams from simple imagination. There's a certain way that dreams feel more real than daydreams or regular imagination. When we imagine something, we can see it with our mind's eye, so to speak, while we're still firmly rooted in quote-unquote normal reality. But in dreaming, it's like we're transported to another world. And this other world imposes itself upon us in such a way that for as long as the dream lasts, we are convinced that the dream world is real. Dreams can be so real, in fact, that it often happens that when we wake up, we need to take a moment to come back to reality. Some dreams have such existential power that we're like in a daze when we wake up, and there is a tiny window of time where we're unsure of what is real and what is a dream. Moreover, we can guide our imagination and make it go wherever we want it to go. Dreams are not like this. Dreams have an internal logic of their own. Dreams go wherever they please, not wherever I please. Again, lucid dreams are an exception to this, but this is not about lucid dreams. Imagination is a totally subjective experience, whereas dreams seem to have this objective quality to them. Even though they are private and thus subjective experiences, they nevertheless seem completely divorced from our own intellect and will, which grants them some measure of objectivity. The dream does what the dream wants, not what I want. So, dreams, properly speaking, occupy this strange liminal space between the objective and the subjective. A consequence of this is that dreams seem to have no relation at all to the thoughts that we had while we were falling asleep. There are some exceptions, like when you're worried about an upcoming exam, you might dream about being in school and failing that exam. But often, dreams seem to have no coherent relationship to your conscious thoughts at all. Most importantly, dreams happen when we are asleep. And ostensibly, that's when the brain is shut off from the outside world and we cannot get any external stimulation. We don't really know where dreams come from, but we do know they must have their origin somewhere in the brain. For Schopenhauer, this is proof that the brain is capable of generating images and sensations on its own. So dreams come from within, yet they also seem to have this strange will of their own, granting them a degree of objectivity. Very strange. Schopenhauer clearly doesn't really know what to make of this information, but he's open to some speculation. He hypothesizes that the brain operates on two levels. It has two modes, so to speak. On the one hand, in normal waking life, the brain fulfills its function as an instrument through which we experience the outside world. Stimuli such as light and sound enter our brain, and the brain creates a coherent picture for us. On the other hand, in sleep, the brain switches its attention to the internal world as it creates dream images for us. Here's where things get interesting. As we fall asleep, there is this gradual switch between the two types of brain activity. As we get ready to fall asleep and shut off external stimuli, for example by turning off the lights and making sure our room is quiet, we free up additional energy resources for the brain to focus on its internal operations. Internal sensations become more pronounced as the brain can divert its energy from the outside world to the inside world. This is the twilight zone between waking life and sleep life. And here, Schopenhauer finds the explanation for those strange experiences we sometimes have right after waking up or just before going to sleep. For in the same way that the eye, through mechanical concussion or internal nervous convulsion, can receive sensations of brightness and radiance completely identical to those caused by external light, in the same way that sometimes the ear, as a consequence of abnormal occurrences within it, hears sounds of every kind, so also can the brain, through stimuli from inside the organism, be determined to execute its function of intuiting space-filling figures. The appearances generated in such a way cannot be distinguished at all from those occasioned by sensations in the sense organs produced by external causes. Schopenhauer doesn't know how this process happens exactly. He hypothesizes the existence of a so-called dream organ deep within the brain, which generates these images. You will notice that this isn't really much of an explanation. Where do dreams come from? They are generated by the dream organ. Where is it? How does it work exactly? Schopenhauer doesn't say. Schopenhauer even explicitly writes that he hopes that future scientists will further investigate this mysterious dream organ. In any case, Schopenhauer runs with this hypothesis. There is a little organ in the brain that he calls the dream organ, and which is responsible for the internal working of the brain. We're used to regard dream visions as false, because the dream disappears as soon as we wake up, and we have this moment of clarity during which we realize, oh, we're back in the real world, and whatever adventures we might have had in the dream world, those are now exposed as fake. But this is not always the case. Take, for example, the common experience of people dreaming about waking up, getting out of bed, taking a shower, etc. These dreams have a distinctly real character to them, to the point that we often only wake up from them when something happens in the dream world that could never happen in real life. But before we get to that point, the dream follows our daily routine so faithfully that when we do wake up, we're in a daze, confused, trying to figure out what just happened. But things get weirder still. Schopenhauer now talks about the widely documented phenomenon, and he provides ample examples from the scientific literature of the day of sleepwalking. These people are sleeping in a trance. They are not actually perceiving things with their external organs, at least not in the common way that we usually perceive things. For example, if you run into a sleepwalker, you might wave your hand in front of their face, and they will not react at all, as if your hand or the whole outside world is invisible to them. That's because they are asleep. Yet, at the same time, they seem to have an uncanny ability to navigate through the world. In the modern day, sleepwalkers have even been known to get into a car and drive. So they aren't perceiving the outside world, and yet, at the same time, they are. Because how else could they navigate the world? Their mode of perception seems to not happen through the external organs, for example, the eyes, but it seems to happen in some other way. Sleepwalkers can't see, yet they seem to be able to dodge obstacles and interact with the world. What could possibly explain this? Well, Schopenhauer gives us no explanation. Instead, he appeals to the mysterious dream organ again. This is what I meant when I said that Schopenhauer is uncharacteristically modest in this essay. He's actually quite unsure of himself, and he readily admits that he doesn't have all the answers here. Accordingly, there is no question at all in any type of somnambulist, sleepwalker, of sensuous perceptions in the proper sense of the word, but their perceiving is an immediate truth dreaming, and thus happens through the deeply mysterious dream organ. Again, Schopenhauer chooses to remain silent on the actual mechanics of the matter, because there is one question here that is simply unavoidable. How does this so-called truth dreaming work, where, despite having shut off all external organs, the sleepwalker nonetheless seems to be able to see, hear, and feel? As regards the correct and precise relationship of the dream intuition to the external world, which is unmistakable in somnambulism, this remains a mystery whose solution I do not undertake. This mysterious dream organ, Schopenhauer speculates, is also responsible for seeing ghosts. In fact, this explains why ghost apparitions always seem to happen in the dark when you are alone at night. It's the same underlying principle at work as when we enter the dream world. Remember, the idea was that when we go to sleep and enter a dream state, the dream gradually shuts off its apparatus for the experience of the external world. This then frees up energy to direct its attention to what happens in the internal world. We actually purposefully help the brain in doing this. We make the room dark and silent so as to not keep bombarding our brain with external stimuli. It's this mechanism, this mysterious working of the brain, that links the dream to the spirit apparition. It's the brain directing its attention from the outside world to the inside world. The same mechanism that creates dream visions in our mind creates spirit visions in the world. But in a dream, we are completely asleep. We create an entirely new universe in our mind's eye. With ghost apparitions, this process is just not completely done. In the dream state, the part of the brain responsible for external stimuli is completely turned off, and the dream organ is completely switched on. In a ghost apparition scenario, the external part is not completely turned off. Let's say it's still 20% on, and meanwhile, the dream organ starts to kick in. So we get this strange mix of external world and internal world. We see the outside world as it normally appears to us. You see your bedroom, your window, your desk. But you also have this internal vision that is kind of superimposed upon it. You see a ghost sitting on your bed or standing ominously in the dark corner of your room. It's no coincidence, says Schopenhauer, that we see ghosts in the dark corners of our rooms, not in the brightly lit parts. That's because the darker things are, the more the brain shuts off and the more energy goes towards the dream organ. That's why ghosts appear in the dark quiet of the night and not during the brightly lit hustle and bustle of midday. In fact, this hypothesis not only explains why ghosts appear at night and in dark areas, it also explains why everyone seems to report that ghosts have this transparent, ethereal quality to them. It's because the brain is in the process of switching between two modes of perception, one foot still in the real world, another foot in the dream world. Of course, the mix maintains qualities of both. Just like when mixing paint, there is a point where you still see the original colors. Here is Schopenhauer's explanation in full. It is an influence arising from within, which stimulates the brain to be intuitively active, an activity that, permeating the brain completely, extends as far as the sensory nerves, with the result that the shapes appearing in this way are even endowed with the color and sheen and also the sound and voice of reality. However, in case this happens imperfectly, they appear only faintly tinged, pale gray, and almost transparent, or, analogously, if they appear to hearing, their voice will be reduced, hollow, muted, hoarse, or chirping. When the seer directs closer attention to these shapes, they usually vanish, because the senses, which now struggle to turn towards external impression, actually receive the latter, which, being stronger and occurring in the opposite direction, overwhelms and pushes back the entire brain activity coming from within. You have to admire how Schopenhauer comes up with a theory that explains almost every stereotypical aspect of ghosts. From their white appearance, the transparency, their sudden disappearance when you pay attention to them, the muffled or low voice, all the way to the fact that they appear in the dead of night, etc. Precisely in order to avoid this collision of the two opposite kinds of brain activity, it happens that, through visions, the inner eye projects the shapes as much as possible where the external eye sees nothing, into dark corners, behind curtains that suddenly turn transparent, and generally into the darkness of night, which is the time of spirits, merely because darkness, silence, and seclusion, eliminating external impressions, allow full scope for that activity of the brain that comes from within. This is what I meant when I said that for Schopenhauer, ghost apparitions have this strange existential quality. They exist in between two states of perception. They are a mix of external and internal stimuli, two sides of the brain being stimulated at the same time, resulting in a bizarre Twilight Zone type of perception. I presume that during such an apparition, consciousness, which, to be sure, is awake, nonetheless is veiled, as if with a very light gauze, through which it acquires a certain, albeit faint, dreamlike tinge. The question still remains what this internal stimulus actually is. In other words, what the dream organ actually does. We'll get to that. It's important to be careful though. Schopenhauer is no fool. He's well aware that hallucinations can happen for all kinds of reasons, as a result of madness, of fever, addiction withdrawal, drug effects, etc. We know those are hallucinations, and they are entirely subjective in nature, precisely because they can be healed or induced with medical treatment. But go back to the discussion on dreams from earlier. A dream imposes itself on us beyond our will. And the nature of the dream often has nothing to do with our thoughts from during the day. And they are totally subjective in the sense that they are universes of our own making, completely and totally. There are some common themes in dreams shared across individuals, like the classic dream of being chased. But as a rule, every person has his own unique dreams. That's a big difference with seeing ghosts. These are all remarkably the same. The ghosts appear at night, in darkly lit rooms. They have this transparent quality to them. And just like dreams, they are imposed upon us without our will. You don't choose to see a ghost. It just happens to you. And they are not totally subjective like dreams. Rather, they are a subjective element in an objective world. Ghosts seem to exist in our objective reality, even if the vision of them itself is subjective. But it's the consistency in ghost stories that leads Schopenhauer to think that they must be more objective than dreams or simple hallucinations. There's one element of the classical ghost story that we haven't talked about yet, arguably the most important one. Who is the ghost? Well, often they're dead people that we personally knew, a friend or a family member. or it's someone who is somehow linked with a location where the ghost appears, like the previous occupant of a haunted house. And often these people died in mysterious circumstances. Schopenhauer once saw the ghost of his dead father. It's generally assumed, and Schopenhauer believed this as well, that Schopenhauer's father died by his own hand. But nothing was ever definitively proven. Then, decades later, his ghost showed up carrying a light and told Schopenhauer that he would outlive his mother. There is a common element here that we see in many different ghost stories. They are deceased individuals coming back to relay a message to the people they left behind. Ghosts with unfinished business. That's the classic story of the haunted house. Someone who is unjustly murdered who keeps coming back to our world to carry out some kind of revenge. Or there is something that must be done in this world so that the soul of the deceased may finally find rest, usually some kind of ritual. This is where ghost stories distinguish themselves from mere dreams or hallucinations. This real connection they always seem to have with the objective world. This, however, is where Schopenhauer runs into a wall. He could speak on dreams with authority, drawing on the scientific literature of the day and his own experience as well as the experiences of others. He could hypothesize a connection between dreaming, hallucinating, and seeing ghosts because they're obviously related phenomena. But now he is reaching the end, because he is quite literally treading new ground here, trying to figure out the mechanics of what makes a ghost a ghost. What is a ghost? It's not a totally subjective hallucination or dream. But it's also not a totally objective phenomenon. They occupy this in-between zone. The dream organ seems to play a role, the part of the brain that creates dreams for us. But dreams exist only within our mind. So this organ, whose purpose it is to create internal visions, now suddenly seems able to create external visions. And Schopenhauer already felt awkward about having to introduce a vague and unknown hypothetical organ like the dream organ in the first place. So the problems are compounding. Precise explanations are lacking. Schopenhauer is running out of steam. We are now leaving scientific explanations behind and throwing ourselves completely and totally into speculation by drawing upon Schopenhauer's philosophy and metaphysics. In Schopenhauer's framework, a ghost apparition would be a temporary breakthrough of the world as will that nevertheless presents itself as representation to us. Strictly speaking, in Schopenhauer's framework, this is not impossible. It's how Schopenhauer speculates that magic works. A magician, Schopenhauer argues, could theoretically exist if we grant the possibility that some humans are able to manipulate the world of will. These changes they make behind the scenes, so to speak, would then find their reverberation in the world as representation, so in the material world. A magician would be someone whose connection to the beyond world is so strong that he can use his powers to effect some change over there, which then finds its expression over here in the representation, the mirror image of the world of will. Schopenhauer not only believed that this was theoretically possible, but that it could actually be possible, in the practical sense of the word. We then get into Schopenhauer's beliefs on magic and animal magnetism, which could be the subject of a follow-up video. Please comment if you want to see a follow-up video on Schopenhauer's beliefs on magic and animal magnetism. But the point is, Schopenhauer keeps open the possibility that the line between world as will and world as representation can become blurred, that they can cross over into each other. If we believe in the possibility of ghosts, then the explanation would be found somewhere here, in the blurring of these lines. For the perplexity attached to the consideration of visions and spirit apparitions originates in the fact that with these perceptions, the boundary between subject and object, which is the first condition of all cognition, becomes doubtful, indistinct, and indeed blurred. Is this outside of me or inside? Everyone will ask who is not robbed of his sobriety by such a vision, as Macbeth does with the dagger floating in front of him. Someone who sees a ghost before him is much like a magician, in the sense that, if we follow Schopenhauer's framework, they have some kind of connection to the metaphysical world, a connection that, evidently, is pretty rare among humans. A metaphor people often use to describe Schopenhauer's philosophy is that of a coin. The world as will and representation is one entity. There is only the world, but it appears to us in two different ways, as will and as representation, as two sides of the same coin. Schopenhauer seems to believe that some people or entities can travel from one side of the coin to the next. These special persons are able to see through the world as representation into its metaphysical foundations, inside the world as will. Recall how representation is the world as it appears to us through the tools of human cognition, and how Schopenhauer is a philosophical idealist. This means that for Schopenhauer, time, space, and causality are not properties of the world as will, but only properties of the world as representation. Following this, if a magician or spirit watcher can somehow circumvent the world as representation and directly access the world as will, then that means this person is not bound by the laws of time, space, and causality. In other words, all bets are off. What is magic? It's precisely defined by an ostensibly miraculous circumvention of time and space. If a magician waves his wand and makes a heavy stone float in the air, he is doing magic. It's magic because it violates the laws of nature. But in Schopenhauer's idealist framework, these are relative laws, not absolute ones. They exist only in the world of representation, not in the world as will. So what the magician does is he somehow is able to circumvent these laws of representation and effect some change directly in the beyond world of the will, which then has its visible effect in our material world. And so the rock starts to float. The magician can do this because he has a special type of connection with the beyond world. Someone who is able to see ghosts has the same connection. They have a special gift. That explains how it is that some people can see ghosts. And then you have the ghosts themselves. For example, souls with unfinished business who haunt their final resting place. For someone dead to become a ghost, that also requires a special connection to the world as will, so they can, as ghosts, violate the laws of time, space, and causality. They can somehow break through the separation between the world as will and representation, and through the force of their will alone, appear to us as representation. But for some reason, this is a limited power. They are not literally risen from the dead. They remain dead. They just appear to someone in a vision, as if they're back. Evidently, not even magic can bring back the dead, but it might allow the dead to come back in another form. Why? We don't know. Schopenhauer remains silent. What we see is by no means the deceased himself, but a mere eidolon, a Platonic idea image, an image of the person who once existed, arising in the dream organ of a human being disposed for it and caused by some remnant, some trace left behind. This is as far as we get. We're already pushing Schopenhauer's philosophy to its utmost limit. A ghost apparition, then, requires two individuals who are both, for some reason or another, predisposed to have a strong connection with the world as will. That is why ghost apparitions are so rare, and they are somehow connected or rooted in the material world. All of this, honestly, doesn't make much sense from a purely philosophical point of view. And ultimately, even Schopenhauer has to stop here. All he can do is hope that future scientists will find out more about where dreams come from. And he notes that this whole business with ghosts and dreams and sleepwalking is a phenomenon that is being studied, and that all questions are not yet answered, but that many phenomena are precisely like that. In fact, at the start of the video, I mentioned electricity, this mysterious, invisible, natural force that leads to so many miraculous outcomes. Schopenhauer says that this ghost business just might be something like electricity, an invisible, undiscovered force of which we can see the effects, but can't explain the cause. That is where we are right now. Schopenhauer was a firmly convinced idealist, and he hated the materialist philosophy of his day, which was becoming increasingly popular as transcendental idealism fell out of favor. To this day, transcendental idealism is the kind of philosophy you learn about in textbooks. It's not something that anyone seriously believes in anymore, some exceptions notwithstanding. So Schopenhauer, sadly, is out of luck. Unless something radical changes in our scientific and philosophical worldviews, we will not investigate the paranormal further in the way that Schopenhauer wanted and hoped for. These questions will remain open-ended and speculative and well outside the purview of conventional academia, at least for the near future. And while Schopenhauer remains silent on the precise mechanics, he does have a point when he says that if we subscribe to transcendental idealism, and to be honest, that's a really big if, but still, if we believe in it, then we cannot simply dismiss ghost stories, prophetic dreams, and magic straight out of hand. Only a materialist can do that, but Schopenhauer thought materialists were stupid and short-sighted. Magic is often waved away for the reasons we just outlined, because it violates the laws of time and space. But Schopenhauer proved, in his mind at least, that these laws are not absolute, but relative. They only exist as tools of human cognition rather than as absolute facts of the world. So magic, in Schopenhauer's framework, is theoretically possible. And if magic is possible, then anything is possible. Regardless of whether or not you personally subscribe to Schopenhauer's philosophy, in general or in his views on the paranormal, this essay of his stands as a beautiful example of just how far a philosophy can go. His entire theory of magic and ghosts follows perfectly logically, even if the specifics are sometimes blurry, out of his main philosophy. It's a beautiful construction, an intricate building with many rooms and corridors. Really, the only question is it built on a firm, rocky foundation or on sand? That is, if, and that's another big if we believe in Schopenhauer's philosophy, then we must also believe in magic and the supernatural. The question is, of course, whether we grant ourselves that big if or not. Schopenhauer himself was convinced on two fronts. First of all, he believed in his own philosophy. He really lived it. It was not an intellectual or academic exercise for him, but an actual reality and fact of life. But perhaps more importantly, he himself had quite a few paranormal experiences that, on a personal level at least, must have convinced him. A dream that predicts his death unless he moves cities, and then he does so just in time to escape a deadly epidemic. A vision of his dead father's ghost. Him reading the mind of his landlady. Perhaps, dear viewer, even if you don't believe in any of the stuff we just talked about, and you buy none of it, perhaps what this video can do is open your mind to at least the possibility, however remote, that things like these can happen, and maybe you will start to pay more attention to your dreams, and who knows what will happen next. As for me, all that's left for me is to thank my patrons and to thank you for watching. These long videos can only happen because of the support I get on Patreon. I upload exclusive material on there as well, so if you find the work we do important, please support the channel over there and get access to exclusive material. Barring that, your likes, comments, and subscribes are greatly appreciated. Our existing Patreons are on screen right now. Join us on Patreon and get access to a dozen and more exclusive videos. If you're interested in more Schopenhauer, I have another hour-long video, this time talking about his main philosophy, which has no talk of ghosts or dreams or whatever. And for the practical Schopenhauer, we have a 2-hour-long video that's a compilation of all Schopenhauer's practical life advice on how to succeed in the world. Check them out if you're interested. And with that, thank you again, and we'll see you in the next one.